Clark calling out Stephanie White for her defensive game plan and the stupid mistakes and things she keeps going back to after seeing they don't work.
She did not whisper it. She did not hide it in diplomatic language designed to protect the people in charge. She walked up to a microphone with cameras rolling and reporters watching, and she named exactly what was broken by mechanism, by failure point, by name. And she said it loud enough for everyone in that room to hear. That moment, that is where this story starts. And by the time it ends, you're going to understand why what happened in that press room did not just shake the Indiana fever. It cracked something that may not be fixable.
And we kind of went back to our old ways where that second rotation we didn't get, and then they scored off the 90 cuts and the 45 cuts.
If you have been following this team all season and something has fell off, like there's a wall between what this roster is capable of and what they are actually doing on the court, stay right here. Because what Caitlin Clark just said out loud, on the record, confirms everything you suspected. Let's go back 24 hours before the press conference. Because to understand what Clark said and why it landed the way it did, you have to understand what kind of day this was supposed to be. This was sneaker debut day. Caitlin Clark's signature shoe, dropping for the first time in a game with cameras specifically positioned to document a commercial milestone. The kind of moment that marketing teams plan months in advance. A cultural event, the kind of afternoon that is supposed to generate highlight packages and celebration clips, and the sort of content a brand builds legacy around. That is what was scheduled. What actually happened was something else entirely. Clark came out and absolutely went to work. 26 points, 7 assists. Going into the fourth quarter, she was putting together the kind of performance that would have made that shoe debut feel like destiny. The cameras were there. The moment was there. And then it collapsed. She fouled out on her own sneaker debut day. In the fourth quarter of a game, the Indiana Fever desperately needed to win. The stat line froze. 26-7. Final. The cameras that were supposed to capture a commercial celebration ended up documenting something far more uncomfortable. An organizational failure playing out in real time, in public, with no place to hide. And the reason she fouled out is not complicated, is not random misfortune. Teams have been doing this all season. They have been hunting Clark specifically, targeting her defensively, attacking her at every available moment, because they know, they have learned that Indiana's defensive structure leaves her isolated in exactly the situations that produce the kind of cheap fouls that sent her to the bench when the game was on the line. On the single biggest commercial day of her entire season, that vulnerability got exploited again in the same way against the same defensive gaps that had already cost this team games before. But what happened next is what made this particular game impossible to quietly move past. Before we keep going, if this is the kind of content you want to see more of, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps more than most people realize. And subscribe if you haven't yet. There's a lot more coming on this situation. Now, let's slow down and actually read what Caitlin Clark said at that podium.
He said, essentially everybody on their team shot over 50%. It's really hard to win a basketball game when that's the case.
Because the specific language she used is the reason this is not just another frustrated athlete comment after a tough loss. This is something different. She did not say we need to play better. She did not deploy the standard post-game deflection that athletes use to sound accountable without actually saying anything. She identified the specific defensive mechanism that broke down. She named the exact moment it happened. She connected it directly to a pattern that had already failed in previous games. And she did all of it with technical precision while the recorders were running.
See that? We went right back to the old defense where nobody's rotating. We're playing one-on-one. There's no help. There's no rotations.
She talked about second rotations not getting executed. She identified the cutting actions that exploited the gap, the 90 cuts, the 45 cuts, specific basketball terminology that describes exactly how the opposing offense found open looks through Indiana's defense. She referenced going back to our old ways, which is not an offhand phrase. That is a player explicitly stating on the record that this is a known problem, a previously identified problem, a problem the coaching staff has been informed of, and that the coaching staff returned to it anyway. Read that again slowly. We went back to our old ways. She is not describing an accident. She is describing a choice that was made despite evidence it would fail. And then she went further.
That's probably on us guards, getting into the ball a little bit better so we don't have to rotate, but I think we could have done a little bit better.
She referenced teammate Kelsey Mitchell arriving at the same conclusion independently in the same press conference. Mitchell pointed out that the entire opposing roster shot over 50% from the field. Not a few players. Every single one of them. When that happens, it is not a fluke. It is not a bad bounce. That is a defensive system that failed to contest a single shot in any meaningful way across 40 minutes of basketball. 2 players. Same locker room. Same defensive result. Same conclusion. Named publicly in the same press conference without anyone coordinating the message in advance. That is not coincidence. That is what it looks like when an entire roster has been living inside a broken system long enough to recognize the same symptoms independently.
We know the Indiana Fever took a disgusting loss to the Atlanta Dream in Caitlin Clark's sneaker debut day in a game where she was absolutely going off, 26-7 going into the fourth quarter, and then she finishes the game with 26-7 due to foul trouble.
Here is the part that most coverage of this situation has completely missed. What Clark said at that podium did not come from nowhere. It is not a hot take reaction to one frustrating loss. It is the latest entry, the most explicit entry in a season-long pattern of philosophical disagreement between Caitlin Clark and Stephanie White about how defense should actually be played at this level. And the disagreement is not subtle. It has been sitting in plain sight for months for anyone paying attention to the specific language Clark uses when she talks about the team's defensive struggles. She has described it as one-on-one defense. Guard your own player. No help, no rotation. Wait until the opposing ball handler already has momentum before trying to contain them, which, if you know anything about basketball, is already too late. By the time you're reacting after the catch, a fast perimeter player has already beaten you. Now compare that to Stephanie White's coaching philosophy, which she has stated publicly and repeatedly throughout this season.
That was pretty much the story of when we had our defensive failings. It was our one-on-one D. We tried to wait until they caught the ball to defend. We didn't make it difficult for them.
Our one-on-one defense. Why are we playing one-on-one the whole time? Now, I get it on straight line blow-bys. I understand that. But you had plays where people are putting the ball on the floor, dribble, and nobody is stepping over to help at any point in time. Why would you go back to this when you saw this did not work?
Them to pass the ball around the perimeter, and they're fast. When they catch it on the run and attack our feet, we're already behind.
Individual defensive responsibility. Win your own matchup. Trust each defender to contain their assignment without requiring a help rotation that takes someone away from their own coverage. On paper, in theory, both of those approaches represent legitimate basketball thinking. There are coaches who build defenses around individual containment. There are defenses that work without complex rotation schemes if the individual defenders are elite enough. But here's the problem with that theory when it runs into the actual evidence from this season. It is not working. It has not worked. It has been documented failing in the same specific way against the same type of opponent multiple times. And Clark and White are looking at those same results and reaching completely opposite conclusions about what they mean. Clark says the one-on-one approach is the problem. White defends the one-on-one approach as the solution. That is not a minor disagreement about when to rotate or how far to extend a help defender. That is a fundamental collision about the core philosophy of how professional basketball defense functions. And it had been building in the background for an entire season before it finally became impossible to contain. Now we get to the moment everyone in that building was watching. Stephanie White's turn at the podium. She had either just heard what her franchise players said, or she knew within minutes. Because in a professional basketball facility after a game, quotes circulate fast. Reporters, staff, assistants, everyone in that building knew what Clark had said before White walked out to face the same cameras. What sources in that press room described was not the composed, message-disciplined coach who typically controls her post-game appearances with careful, deflecting language. What they described was visible frustration, audible tension, someone who looked, in the words of people present in that room, like a head coach who had just watched her own player publicly dismantle her defensive philosophy and was not handling it well. And what White did at that podium was exactly what the entire arc of this season predicted she would do. She did not acknowledge the rotation breakdown Clark had just named in technical detail. She did not engage with the specific critique that had just been delivered on the record. She returned to the same defensive talking points. Individual responsibility, guard your matchup, one-on-one containment. The exact philosophy that Clark had just explained, specifically and publicly, was the source of Indiana's defensive problems. Think about what that image looks like from the outside. Your franchise player walks out and explains, in basketball terms, with precision and specificity, exactly why the system keeps failing. Then the coach responsible for that system walks out minutes later, visibly agitated, and defends the system anyway. That is not a minor tension that gets resolved in a film session the next morning. That is a documented, public demonstration of two people running the same organization who are simply not seeing the same basketball game. 3 times. That is the number that makes this impossible to dismiss as growing pains or philosophical disagreement or the natural friction that comes with any competitive environment. Golden State, Portland, Atlanta, 3 separate opponents, 3 separate games. The same defensive vulnerability exploited in the same way each time. The same failure to execute second rotations. The same cutting actions finding open looks through the same gaps in Indiana's coverage. And after Golden State, Clark named the problem. After Portland, Clark named the problem again. After Atlanta, on sneaker debut day, fouled out, loss finalized. Clark named it a 3rd time. 3 separate opportunities for the coaching staff to absorb that information and make an adjustment. 3 separate instances of the same system being deployed anyway. 3 times the opposing offense found the same holes in the same way and scored the same points off the same failures. At a certain point, that stops being a philosophical choice and starts being something more alarming. A coaching staff that has shown the same evidence 3 times by its own best player in real time and returns to the same approach that produced that evidence. That is not stubbornness as a competitive virtue. That is a failure to incorporate information that is being provided directly, repeatedly, and accurately. The defensive vulnerability Clark identified is not obscure. It is not some complex scheme that takes a graduate degree in basketball theory to understand. Failing to execute help rotations, leaving cutting actions uncontested, allowing opponents to catch the ball at full speed on the perimeter. These are fundamental defensive breakdowns. The fact that Indiana has now allowed them to happen in documented fashion across 3 different opponents, with the team's own best player correctly diagnosing the failure mechanism after each instance, is a coaching pattern that has moved well past the point of reasonable defense. Now let's talk about what all of this is actually costing, because the press conference confrontation is dramatic on its own terms, but the real stakes sitting underneath it are significant enough that the Indiana Fever front office needs to be having a very direct conversation about them right now. Caitlin Clark is producing at a level that should put her in serious MVP consideration. 20 points a game, 8 assists, numbers that rank top 5 in the entire WNBA. That is not a player who is underperforming. That is a player putting up genuinely elite statistical production while her team is sitting in 7th place. 7th place, with a top 5 statistical producer on the floor. That gap between what Clark is doing individually and what Indiana is doing as a team is not a talent problem. It is not a mystery. It has a specific documented cause that Clark herself has identified and named publicly multiple times. And that gap is now showing up in the MVP race. Aya Wilson is having a monster season for Las Vegas. 26 points, 9 rebounds, 3 assists, 2 blocks, while leading a team with one of the best records in the league. Paige Buchers has turned around the Dallas situation in year 2 and is building her own case. The prediction markets that track MVP probability have shown Clark sliding steadily over the last month, not because her numbers dropped, but because the team's record has not backed up the individual production. MVP voters weight team records heavily. Everyone knows this, And every loss that traces back to a defensive breakdown Clark has already identified and named publicly. Every one of those losses is pulling her individual award candidacy down through no fault of her own performance. Stephanie White's refusal to adjust the defensive system is not just costing Indiana basketball games. It is actively costing Caitlin Clark MVP consideration that her individual statistical output has clearly earned. That is the real-world consequence sitting underneath what looked like a tense post-game press conference. The commercial stakes are just as real. Clark's brand is built on winning, on excellence, on the kind of individual brilliance that produces championships and cultural moments. Every time this team loses a game that traces back to the same preventable defensive failure, that brand takes a hit it did not earn and cannot absorb indefinitely. So where does this land? Caitlin Clark stood at a microphone on her own sneaker debut day after fouling out a loss the Indiana Fever should not have taken, and she named specifically, technically on the record, exactly what is broken about her own team's defense. She did not protect the coaching staff. She did not deploy the diplomatic language that athletes typically use to avoid making headlines. She described a systemic failure with the kind of precision that only comes from a player who has been watching the same problem repeat itself and has run out of patience waiting for it to be addressed. Stephanie White took that same podium minutes later, visibly frustrated, and defended the exact philosophy her franchise player had just publicly identified as the source of the problem. That is not a minor disagreement. That is two people with fundamentally incompatible understandings of how to win basketball games, running the same organization at the moment when the gap between them has become too visible and too costly to ignore. The Indiana Fever front office has a direct question in front of it. When your franchise player, the most statistically productive guard in the league, the player whose commercial value built this organization's entire current trajectory, stands at a podium and explains in technical detail why your defense keeps failing, and your head coach responds by defending the system anyway, while visibly agitated about having to address the critique. Who do you believe understands this team's path to winning more clearly? Clark has been right about this pattern across 3 opponents, 3 separate opportunities to adjust, 3 separate instances of the same failure. The press conference confrontation is not the crisis. It is the symptom. The crisis is a coaching staff that is not listening to the evidence its own best player has been providing. Evidence that is costing wins, costing MVP consideration, and now visibly fracturing the relationship between the head coach and the franchise player at exactly the moment this organization can least afford that fracture. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Does Stephanie White finally adjust the defense after being publicly called out by the most important player in the building? Or does this pattern continue until the Indiana Fever front office has no choice but to make a decision that nobody inside that organization wants to make? If you made it this far, you already know whether to like and subscribe, but do it anyway, because there's a lot more coming on this story, and you do not want to miss where it goes next.